I am Ethan. I am 32 years old, and my father just erased my existence from his life with a simple, cowardly text message. Before I walk you through the absolute financial and legal hellstorm that I unleashed in response, you need to understand the exact moment the war began. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesdays are usually quiet, dedicated to deep-dive paperwork and endless cups of black coffee. I am a forensic fraud examiner. My entire professional existence revolves around the anatomy of a lie. I dissect corporate balance sheets, trace hidden offshore accounts, and find the exact moment a person decides that their greed is more important than their integrity. I spend my days tracking where the money went when desperate, arrogant people try to hide it. I was sitting in my ergonomic office chair, staring at a complex variance report for a major hospitality client, my eyes scanning columns of numbers that didn't quite add up. The air conditioner in the building hummed a low, steady rhythm. Then, my phone buzzed against the hard mahogany surface of the desk. It was a single, sharp vibration. I glanced down. The caller ID on the screen simply read, Robert, my father. I didn't smile. We had not been on smiling terms for a very long time, mostly because our relationship had devolved into an endless series of ungrateful transactions. I reached over and unlocked the screen. The message waiting for me was stark, brutal, and completely devoid of any human warmth. It did not have a greeting. It did not have a signature. It was just two sentences designed to end 32 years of a supposed father and son relationship. I disown you. All communication goes through my lawyer. I sat back and stared at the words. The white pixels seemed to burn a little brighter than the rest of the dark screen. I disown you. The phrasing felt archaic, almost theatrical, like a line stolen from a cheap 19th century novel rather than a text message sent in the modern era. But knowing Robert, he probably typed those words thinking he sounded powerful, authoritative, and terrifying. He likely pictured himself as a king banishing a traitorous peasant from his royal court. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to immediately dial his number, weeping, begging for forgiveness, promising to open my wallet and pay whatever toll was required to get back into his good graces. But my heart did not race. My hands did not shake. There was no cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. That was the most surprising part of it all. I sat there, completely still, waiting for the familiar wave of guilt or the sudden rush of panic that usually flooded my system whenever I upset him. But there was absolutely nothing. Just a strange, hollow, beautiful quiet. The invisible leash he had held around my neck for over a decade simply snapped. I tapped the screen and typed back a single word. Okay. I hit send. Then, I placed the phone face down on the desk, effectively burying Robert, and turned my attention back to my dual monitors. But I did not return to my client's variance report. Instead, I opened a new encrypted tab and navigated straight to my personal banking website. You have to understand the context here. For the last 4 years, I had not just been a son to that man and my mother, Patricia. I had been their entire financial lifeline. I was the concrete pillar holding up a roof that I was barely even welcome under. I logged into the portal. The two-factor authentication code buzzed on my wrist, and I typed the digits in with steady, precise keystrokes. The financial dashboard loaded, displaying my checking and savings accounts. I immediately clicked over to the Recurring Transfers tab. Right there, sitting at the very top of the list, was a scheduled payment labeled Robert and Patricia Mortgage Support. It was an automatic transfer set for $2,500, scheduled to be withdrawn on the first of every single month. The next payment was queued up to go out in exactly 48 hours. I moved my mouse and hovered the cursor over the bright red Cancel button. For a fraction of a second, just a microscopic split second, my finger hesitated over the mouse. It was not out of guilt or remorse. It was purely out of deeply ingrained habit. Taking care of them, absorbing their financial disasters, had become muscle memory. It was a deep, toxic groove worn directly into my brain over years of manipulation. The script I had been forced to read from since I was 28 years old played in my head. If I do not pay this, they lose the house. If they lose the house, the family falls apart, and it will be entirely my fault. But then I thought about the text message. All communication goes through my lawyer. Well, in my professional experience, lawyers generally do not pay mortgages for their opposing counsel. I clicked cancel. A secondary confirmation box popped up on the screen, asking, "Are you absolutely sure you want to cancel this recurring payment?" I clicked yes without blinking. The status updated to canceled in bright red letters. But I was not even close to being done. I was a forensic examiner. When I clean house, I clean it all the way down to the foundation. I scrolled down the page to the next liability, the family cellular plan. I was fully funding 4 premium unlimited lines. Mine, Robert's, Patricia's, and my older brother Jason's. Jason is 35 years old. He is a grown man who has not paid a single utility or phone bill in an entire decade. I opened a new tab for the telecom carrier, logged into the administrative settings, and selected the 3 lines belonging to Robert, Patricia, and Jason. I clicked Remove from Plan. The system flashed a warning. These lines will be permanently suspended immediately unless a new valid payment method is added. I clicked Confirm. I kept the momentum going. Next was the business credit line. 3 years ago, Robert's supposed consulting business was failing spectacularly. His personal credit was entirely shot, his debt-to-income ratio was a joke, and no legitimate bank would touch him. He needed a cosigner with pristine credit to secure a lifeline. I foolishly signed my name. It was a $50,000 line of credit. I checked the current balance on the screen. He had maxed it out to $48,000, making bare minimum payments while continuing to spend. While I was technically still liable for the outstanding debt as a cosigner, I had the administrative authority to freeze the card to prevent him from racking up a single new charge. I logged into the credit portal and executed a hard freeze on the account. Then, I initiated a formal dispute to sever my cosigner status, citing a complete breakdown of the relationship, and sent a secure, documented notification to the bank that I would no longer cover the monthly minimum payments. It was a calculated legal maneuver. It might be a long shot to get off the hook for the existing $48,000, but it would instantly lock up the account and trigger an aggressive collections process against Robert. Took me exactly 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, using just a mouse and a keyboard, I systematically dismantled the entire financial infrastructure of my family. I sat back in my chair, listening to the hum of the office. I picked up my paper cup and took a long sip of my coffee. It had gone completely cold, but I swear to you, it tasted better, richer, and sweeter than any cup of coffee I had ever consumed in my entire life. The silence from my phone was deafening. I knew the quiet would not last. I knew exactly how this game was played. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. Thursday morning arrived. I was standing in my apartment's kitchen, making a simple piece of toast. The early morning sun was streaming through the blinds, hitting the granite countertop and creating warm, golden lines across the room. It was an incredibly peaceful morning. I had slept for 8 solid, uninterrupted hours the night before, a biological luxury that had literally not happened for me in years. Then the peace shattered. My phone resting on the counter began to ring. It wasn't a text message this time. It was an incoming call. The caller ID boldly displayed, Patricia. Mom. I leaned against the counter and simply watched the screen light up, vibrating against the stone surface. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4 rings. Patricia never, ever called me just to say hello or ask how my day was going. She only dialed my number when there was a catastrophe, a crisis, or an urgent demand for cash. And based on the timeline I had initiated on Tuesday, I knew exactly what this particular crisis was. The bank's automated system had just attempted to pull the $2,500 mortgage payment, and it had hit a brick wall. The well was officially dry. I picked up the phone right on the 5th ring. I did not say hello. I just swiped to answer and pressed the cold glass to my ear, waiting. Ethan! Her voice exploded through the speaker. It was high, thin, and completely laced with a hysterical, frantic panic. It was the exact pitch and tone that used to make my stomach drop into my shoes, a sound carefully conditioned to trigger my anxiety and compliance. "Ethan, are you there?" "I'm here," I said. My voice came out flat, level, and completely calm. It sounded so detached that it felt foreign to my own ears. "The bank just called your father," Patricia shrieked, barely taking a breath. "They said the payment was rejected, insufficient funds, or the transfer was canceled. I don't understand what is happening. It is due today, Ethan. Today. If it is not paid by 5 o'clock this evening, they are going to hit us with a massive late fee, and it's going to destroy your father's credit score. You need to log in and fix this right now." I let her words hang in the air for a moment. Notice the pattern. There was no, "How are you doing?" There was no, "Why did this happen?" Or, "Is everything all right with your job?" There was just an immediate, entitled demand. "Fix it." I took a slow, deliberate bite of my toast. The dry crunch echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen, transmitting clearly over the phone line. "I can't fix it, Patricia," I said smoothly. The line went dead silent. A stunned, incredibly heavy silence fell over the connection. I had never, in my entire 32 years of life, referred to her by her first name. It had always been Mom. What did you just say?" she whispered, the panic momentarily overridden by sheer shock. "I said I can't fix it. And even if I could, I won't," I clarified, enunciating every syllable. "Ethan, stop playing these childish games right now," she suddenly snapped, her shock rapidly morphing into aggressive anger. "This isn't funny. Transfer the money. Your father is absolutely furious. He is pacing around the living room kicking furniture. His blood pressure is going through the roof. Do you want him to have a stroke?" Yes, the classic medical guilt trip. That was always the ultimate trump card she played whenever they needed me to submit. Robert's health, Robert's stress, Robert's imminent medical collapse caused by my defiance. "I received a text message on Tuesday afternoon," I said, looking down at the crumbs scattered on my plate. "Robert disowned me. He explicitly stated that all communication from now on goes through his lawyer." "Oh, for God's sake," she scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound. "He was just mad. You know exactly how he gets when he's stressed about the business. He didn't mean it literally. Stop being so incredibly sensitive and dramatic. He said all communication, Patricia." I repeated, my tone unyielding. "Sending $2,500 a month is a very loud form of communication. It communicates that I am still his obedient doormat. And since I have been officially disowned, I really don't think doormats are part of the inheritance." "Inheritance?" she sputtered, her voice cracking. "You're talking about money and inheritance when we are literally about to lose the house." "I'm talking about legal boundaries," I countered. "He told me to talk to his lawyer. So, if you want that mortgage paid, have his legal counsel draft and send a formal request to my legal counsel. I'll wait right here." "We don't have a lawyer, Ethan," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of control. "Please. And Jason's phone is disconnected too. He can't even get online." "What did you do?" "I cut the cellular lines," I stated factually. "I am no longer paying a monthly premium for a 35-year-old man to lay on your couch and browse social media all day." "You are destroying this family," she began to sob. The tears started flowing, loud and wet. These were the weaponized tears that had worked so flawlessly to break my resolve for years. "After everything we did for you, we raised you. We gave you life. And I gave you $158,000 over the last 4 years, I replied, feeling a profound sense of finality. Consider my life debt paid in full. We are completely square. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off her wailing mid-sentence. I tossed the device onto the counter and stared at it. My right hand was shaking slightly, but not from fear, not from anxiety. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I had finally done it. I had finally looked the beast in the eye and said the word no. But I was a strategist. I knew this was far from over. Parasites do not simply let their host walk away without a fight. They wouldn't just watch their personal ATM shut down and accept it. They were going to come for me. They were going to try to hurt me professionally, personally, and emotionally. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with anymore. They didn't know that I was ready for a war. They didn't know that I had already built my fortress. And most importantly, they didn't know that I had seen the video. To truly understand why I could hang up on my weeping mother without feeling a single ounce of guilt, you have to understand the catalyst. You have to know about the video. Because the brutal text message from Robert didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the explosive result of a confrontation that I had initiated. And the real trigger for all of this occurred exactly 48 hours before he tried to banish me from his kingdom. To comprehend the depth of the betrayal, we need to look at the ledger. As an auditor, when human emotions become too tangled and toxic, I rely on raw data. Numbers do not gaslight you. Numbers do not cry on demand to manipulate your empathy. Let's rewind 4 years. It was late 2022. Robert's boutique consulting firm, a business built more on his golf club memberships than actual industry expertise, had taken a massive nosedive. He had recklessly leveraged the equity in the family home to keep his failing enterprise afloat, desperate to maintain the illusion of success to his peers. He was days away from a total default. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the massive, 4-bedroom colonial house I grew up in. They called an emergency family meeting in the living room. I remember the staging perfectly. Patricia was weeping softly into a tissue on the expensive leather sofa. Robert was standing by the large bay window, staring out at the manicured lawn. His shoulders slumped in a performance of a defeated patriarch that deserved an Academy Award. "You're the only one who can save us, Ethan," Patricia had sobbed, reaching out to grasp my hand. "Your brother Jason. Well, you know Jason is going through a transitional phase right now. He's trying to find himself. But you have that incredible corporate job. You're the responsible one. I cannot bear to lose this house, my son." Then Robert turned from the window, his eyes shining with carefully manufactured tears. "It's our legacy, Ethan," he said, his voice trembling just the right amount. "It's all I have left to leave you boys." At the time, I had just secured a major promotion at my firm. I had accumulated a healthy savings account. I was actively touring properties, looking to finally buy my own place. But the guilt was too heavy. I couldn't stomach the thought of my parents being thrown out onto the street while I slept in a new house. So I made a devil's bargain. I agreed to cover their mortgage, $2,500 every single month, just until the consulting business stabilized. Robert looked me in the eye and swore on his life it would only be for 6 months, maybe a year at the absolute maximum. That was 4 years ago. Over those 48 months, every single time I tried to gently bring up an exit strategy, Robert would instantly become hostile and defensive. "The market is incredibly volatile right now, Ethan. You're just a numbers guy. You don't understand the complex realities of running a business," he would bark. If that didn't work, Patricia would deploy the tears. "Are you really threatening to kick your own mother out onto the curb? After I carried you for 9 months. So I submitted. I kept paying. I put my entire personal life on indefinite hold. I drove a battered, 10-year-old sedan so they could keep their pristine house in the affluent suburbs. I lived in a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment with faulty plumbing so my parents could maintain a 4-bedroom home with an empty guest room. But it wasn't just the mortgage. The boundaries eroded completely. I opened a private spreadsheet on my laptop and tracked every cent I bled for them. Mortgage payments, $120,000. Clearing Jason's catastrophic credit card debts because he needed a fresh start, $15,000. Major repairs for Robert's luxury SUV, $8,000. Medical relaxation vacations for Patricia's mysterious stress ailments, $10,000. Random, unrecorded cash loans that were never repaid, $5,000. The grand total sat at a staggering $158,000. That massive, life-altering sum of money was simply the price of my admission to exist in this family. It was the subscription fee I paid to avoid their wrath. And despite bankrupting my own future for them, it had not purchased me a single ounce of genuine love. It hadn't even bought me basic human respect. I realized, with bitter clarity, that I was not participating in a family dynamic. I was trapped in a predatory financial subscription service, and I was the premium tier subscriber who was continually blocked from receiving any of the actual content. But the money alone wasn't enough to kill my empathy. I needed a harder push. I needed a visceral betrayal. That brings us to the Rolex. The illusion of my family's decency began to fracture heavily about 3 weeks before the final text message. It started over something deeply sentimental, something money wasn't supposed to touch. My grandfather, before he passed away, left me a vintage 1970s Rolex watch. It wasn't the flashiest model, but it was the only piece of genuine family history I cared about. Because my apartment had been broken into a year prior, I had foolishly left the watch in a small lockbox in my old childhood bedroom at my parents' house, thinking it was the safest place on earth. One Saturday, I drove out to the suburbs specifically to retrieve it. I had a formal gala for my firm coming up, and I wanted to wear it. When I walked into the house, Patricia was sitting in the kitchen. The moment I mentioned I was going upstairs to get the watch, her entire demeanor shifted. She became hyperactive, nervously arranging fruit in a bowl, refusing to make eye contact. "Oh, Ethan, honey, your father was actually doing some deep cleaning in your old room," she stammered, her voice pitched unnaturally high. "He might have moved some of your boxes around. Let's look for it later. Stay and have some tea." My forensic instincts, honed by years of interrogating nervous embezzlers, immediately flared. People who are telling the truth do not suddenly obsess over organizing apples. I ignored her protests, walked upstairs, and opened the closet. The lockbox was there, but the cheap metal latch was broken, pried open. Inside it was empty. I marched back downstairs, holding the empty box. Patricia burst into tears before I even opened my mouth. She babbled a chaotic story about how Robert had taken it to a specialized jeweler downtown just to get it polished for me, wanting it to be a surprise. It was a flimsy, pathetic lie. I didn't yell. I simply went back to my apartment and logged into my professional investigative software. It took me less than 45 minutes of searching local pawn shop registries, which, as a licensed fraud examiner, I know exactly how to access to find it. Robert hadn't taken it to a jeweler. He had taken my grandfather's watch to a high-end pawnbroker in the city. He had pawned my sole inheritance for $8,000 cash. But where did the $8,000 go? Robert's business didn't show a sudden cash injection. The mortgage was already paid by me. I pulled Jason's public social media feeds. Jason, the 35-year-old transitional artist who couldn't afford his own cell phone bill. There it was. An entire album of high-definition photos posted just 3 days after the watch was pawned. Jason, holding a margarita on a pristine, white sand beach. Jason at a luxury resort in Cancun, Mexico. The caption read, "Huge shout out to the best dad in the world for funding this much-needed mental health retreat. #blessed, #family first." I sat in the dark glow of my monitors, feeling a profound, icy numbness spread through my chest. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. My father had stolen a priceless family heirloom from the son who was actively saving him from homelessness, pawned it, and used the cash to send his unemployed, favored son on a luxury tropical vacation. They didn't just lack respect for me. They viewed me as an unlimited resource to be mined, plundered, and discarded. I was a host organism and they were feeding. I didn't confront them about the watch immediately. A good investigator never reveals his hand until the trap is fully set. I needed to see how deep the rot went. I didn't have to wait long. The universe, in a rare moment of poetic justice, delivered the final nail in the coffin directly to my phone just a few weeks later. It was a Sunday afternoon, precisely 48 hours before the infamous text message. I was at home, prepping case files for the upcoming work week, trying to ignore the dull ache of the pond watch. My phone pinged. It was a message from my Uncle Mark. Mark is Robert's younger brother. He's the stereotypical fun uncle. The guy who never really grew up, always wearing overly trendy clothes and trying to act like he's still in his 20s. The text message simply read, "Look at this." I frowned. It was a cryptic message, and Mark rarely texted me directly unless he needed tech support. Below the text was a video file attachment. It looked like it had been casually recorded on a smartphone. I pressed play, unaware that I was about to watch the complete, televised assassination of my empathy. The video opened. The camera work was shaky at first, panning slowly across a room I knew intimately, better than I knew my own apartment. It was the formal dining room of my parents' house. The large oak table was beautifully set with the expensive imported china, the plates Patricia only ever brought out for highly esteemed special guests. There was a massive, perfectly cooked prime rib roast sitting proudly in the center of the table, surrounded by multiple open bottles of expensive red wine. I wasn't there. I hadn't even been informed this dinner was happening. In fact, when I had spoken to Patricia briefly on Saturday to check in, she had sighed heavily and told me they were just having a quiet, depressing night in, maybe ordering a cheap pizza because money was so tight. The camera stabilized. I could clearly see the faces illuminated by the chandelier. My father, Robert, was sitting at the head of the table, holding a premium craft beer, his face flushed. Patricia was seated next to him, laughing uproariously at something he had just said. My Aunt Nicole, Mark's wife, was wiping literal tears of laughter from her eyes, and sitting opposite Robert was my brother, Jason, leaning back in his chair, picking at his food, looking incredibly smug and satisfied. Uncle Mark was clearly the one behind the camera. I could hear his slightly muffled voice from behind the lens. "But seriously, Rob," Mark said, his tone jovial, "the SUV looks amazing after the repairs. You've really got to thank the kid. Ethan's a good kid for helping you out with that massive bill." My stomach tightened instinctively. I had just paid a $2,000 mechanics bill for Robert's transmission 2 weeks prior. On the screen, Robert's face morphed. The smile didn't entirely leave his features, but it twisted, contorting into something incredibly ugly, resentful, and cruel. He took a deep swig of his beer and snorted loudly. "He's not a kid, Mark," Robert scoffed. His voice was booming, slurred just enough to indicate he was at least 3 beers deep into the evening. "He's an ATM, and an incredibly lonely, pathetic one at that." The entire table erupted. Aunt Nicole slapped the mahogany wood. "An ATM?" she cackled wildly. "Oh my God, Rob, that's too good." Robert wasn't finished performing for his audience. He leaned forward, pointing the neck of his beer bottle directly at the camera lens as if addressing me. "He is so desperate for my approval, Mark. It's honestly pathetic to watch. He would pay for the literal oxygen we breathe if I demanded it. I snap my fingers and the boy writes a check. He actually thinks he's buying my love." I sat frozen in my apartment watching the screen. I could physically feel the blood draining from my face, leaving my skin cold. Then Jason chimed in. Jason, the man whose Caribbean vacation was funded by my grandfather's stolen watch. "It's honestly sad to watch," Jason sneered, using a toothpick. "He genuinely thinks sending Dad money makes him important, like he's suddenly the man of the house or something. But at the end of the day, he's still just, Ethan." "The wallet." Aunt Nicole raised her wine glass high into the air. "To the wallet," she cheered. Robert roared with laughter. They all raised their glasses. They clinked them together in a toast. They drank the expensive wine I had unknowingly financed. They carved into the premium roast that was purchased with the cash I had transferred to Patricia just days before so they wouldn't starve. The video abruptly ended, plunging my phone screen into darkness. I stared at my reflection in the black glass. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I think, deep down in the darkest recesses of my subconscious, I had always known exactly how they viewed me. But hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing the specific venomous terms ATM, pathetic, and wallet, it acted like a scalpel. It sliced through the thick, suffocating fog of familial obligation. It snapped the heavy steel wire that had been artificially transmitting my empathy and guilt to them for decades. I hit play. I watched it a second time, then a third, then a fourth. I needed the audio to burn permanently into the pathways of my memory. I needed to ensure I would never, ever forget the sound of their laughter. That Sunday night, operating with a new, terrifying clarity, I decided to test the waters. I sent Robert a very simple, polite text message. I did not mention the video. I did not mention the stolen Rolex. I wrote, "Dad, we need to schedule a time to talk about the mortgage. I am looking to finalize a purchase on my own house this year. We need to establish a firm timeline for when you will resume making your own payments." That was it. That reasonable boundary was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Robert didn't reply for 2 full days. I knew exactly what was happening. He was stewing. He was pacing the house, talking to Jason and Patricia, whipping himself into a narcissistic, righteous rage that his property, his wallet, had dared to demand a timeline, had dared to threaten the unlimited supply of cash. And then, on Tuesday afternoon, he launched what he thought was the nuclear option. He sent the text, "I disown you." In his twisted, arrogant mind, he truly believed that the horrific threat of cutting me off emotionally would shatter me. He expected me to panic, to come crawling back on my hands and knees, begging to pay his bills just to hear him call me son again. He thought his silence would break my spirit. He didn't realize that by formally disowning me, he hadn't punished me. He had handed me the exact legal and emotional permission I needed to set myself free. And more importantly, he had provoked a forensic fraud examiner with full access to his financial history. Let's return to Thursday afternoon, just hours after I hung up on Patricia's frantic demands. The digital assault from my newly estranged family had reached a fever pitch. My phone was lighting up like a distressed slot machine. First, the barrage came from Jason. "You are an absolute psychopath. Mom is hysterical and Dad's credit is ruined because of your tantrum. Turn the money back on right now or I am driving over there to handle this myself." I scoffed at the screen. Jason threatening physical violence? Jason couldn't afford the gasoline required to drive his financed car across the city to my apartment. And even if he miraculously found a ride, what was his grand plan? To assault me? The last time we had a physical altercation, I was 12. I am now a fully grown man who hits the boxing gym 3 mornings a week to manage the immense stress of my career. Jason's most strenuous physical activity was lifting his arm to signal a waiter at a resort I paid for. Then came the text from Aunt Nicole. "Whatever sick, childish game you are playing, you need to stop it immediately. You must apologize to Robert. You are breaking your poor mother's heart. You are so ungrateful. Ungrateful. Ungrateful." The word hung in the air, dripping with irony. I glanced over at my open spreadsheet. $158,000, plus an $8,000 stolen Rolex, equaled a monumental amount of ungratefulness. I did not reply to any of them. The absolute no-contact protocol was firmly in effect. However, ignoring them wasn't enough. They were still fundamentally operating under the old rules of engagement. They genuinely believed this was just a temporary tantrum, a brief rebellion from a subordinate. They thought I was a child throwing a fit and locking myself in my bedroom. They had not yet grasped the terrifying reality that I was the bank, and the bank was permanently foreclosing on their toxic nonsense. Late that afternoon, a courier buzzed my apartment building. "Delivery for Ethan." The voice crackled over the intercom. I went down to the lobby and signed for a thick, heavy manila envelope. It wasn't a standard letter. It was from a law firm located in a cheap strip mall on the outskirts of the city. I ripped it open right there by the mailboxes. It was a formal cease and desist order. The document was bloated with aggressive, nonsensical legal jargon. It aggressively accused me of defamation of character, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and financial abandonment. It demanded a formal, written public apology to Robert, the immediate reinstatement of all financial support, and a payment of $75,000 to cover damages to his professional reputation and health. I stood in the lobby and read the demands twice. Then, a dry, completely humorless laugh escaped my throat. Robert wanted to play the legal game? He wanted to threaten an auditor with paperwork? I deal with complex, multimillion-dollar regulatory compliance every single day of my life. I know the exact difference between a terrifying, legally binding document and a toothless intimidation tactic drafted by a desperate man. But I also knew that if I was going to sever this rotting limb permanently, I shouldn't perform the surgery myself. I needed a shark. I pulled out my phone and dialed the direct number of a corporate attorney I had collaborated with on a massive embezzlement case 2 years prior. Audrey Vance, legal counsel. A sharp, perfectly modulated voice answered on the second ring. "Hi, Audrey," I said, leaning against the lobby wall. "It's Ethan. I have a detailed financial ledger proving over $150,000 in extracted funds, a stolen family heirloom, a video of my family toasting to my status as their personal ATM, and a laughably bad cease and desist letter from my father demanding 75 grand. I need to retain your services immediately." There was a brief, calculating pause on the other end of the line. Then, I heard the distinct click of an expensive pen being deployed. "I'm listening, Ethan. Come up to my office." Audrey's office was located on the 40th floor of a sleek glass tower downtown, a universe away from the strip mall firm Robert had hired. It smelled of rich mahogany, success, and intimidation. Audrey sat across the massive desk from me, a woman in her late 40s with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She skimmed the cease and desist letter for roughly 30 seconds before tossing it contemptuously onto her desk like it was a piece of junk mail. "This is absolute garbage," she stated flatly. "It's a generic template downloaded from the internet. I've seen this exact, poorly structured wording 100 times. He probably paid a paralegal $100 to print it on somewhat official-looking letterhead. So, I assume I don't owe him $75,000 for hurting his feelings?" I asked, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to uncoil. Audrey leaned forward, interlacing her fingers. "Defamation requires a statement to be demonstrably false. Truth is an absolute, impenetrable defense. Do you have the bank statements proving every single cent you gave him? Every transfer, every check, every frozen credit line is fully documented and indexed," I replied. "Then he has zero legal standing." In fact, Audrey smiled, a predatory, terrifying smile that made me incredibly grateful she was sitting on my side of the table. Based on his threats, we could easily countersue for targeted harassment and financial extortion. "I don't want a single dime of his money," I said firmly. "I want him to leave me alone. I want an impenetrable, legally enforced clean break. I will draft a response that will make his discount lawyer sweat," she promised. "We'll aggressively demand immediate proof of these supposed damages and threaten a full, invasive legal discovery process. Narcissists are terrified of discovery. They despise having competent people dig through their dirty secrets." The word secrets hung in the air. It triggered a deep, professional alarm in my auditor's brain. I thought about the pawned watch. I thought about the sheer, blinding panic in Patricia's voice over a single missed mortgage payment. "Speaking of secrets," I said slowly, the pieces of a much darker puzzle beginning to align in my mind, "there's an anomaly I can't quite reconcile." Audrey raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Go on." "Robert has always been incredibly sloppy with his personal accounting," I explained. "His consulting business has been essentially dead in the water for years. Yet, somehow he always managed to inexplicably find loose cash for expensive golf trips, premium imported beer, and supposedly an $8,000 tropical vacation for my brother Jason. All of this happening while he concurrently claimed he couldn't afford a $2,000 mortgage." I leaned closer to the desk, If his business is supposedly recovering enough that he feels confident enough to disown his primary financial backer, then missing a single $2,000 payment shouldn't have caused a catastrophic, screaming meltdown from my mother on Thursday morning. The math does not support their narrative. Audrey's eyes narrowed. You suspect he has an undisclosed income stream? That he's skimming money from somewhere else? I suspect his sloppy business practices are a highly convenient cover story, I said, the realization settling like ice in my veins. I think he's been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, and now that I've aggressively cut off the supply line, he is in immediate, desperate need of liquidity. Is he in a position of trust anywhere? Does he manage funds that don't belong to him? She asked, her voice dropping an octave. I nodded slowly. He is the lead treasurer for a local community medical relief fund, the Sophia Memorial Fund. It was set up to help an elderly widow in our neighborhood, Mrs. Sophia, who is battling late-stage cancer. The community raised a significant amount of money for her chemotherapy treatments, and Robert volunteered to manage the accounts because he's a businessman. Audrey stopped tapping her pen. The silence in the office was absolute. Ethan, she said carefully, if he is actively embezzling from a registered charitable fund meant for a cancer patient, we are no longer discussing civil court or family drama. We are talking about state prison. I know exactly what we are talking about, I replied, my voice hard. I need to see those books. You can't just hack into the accounts. You are not the appointed auditor for that specific fund, she warned. No, I agreed. But the fund operates as a registered nonprofit. Their basic tax filings are public record. And Mrs. Sophia's daughter trusts me. I used to tutor her kids. If I approach her with credible concerns and ask for explicit permission to review the raw bank statements to ensure her mother isn't being defrauded, she might grant me legal access. Audrey stared at me for a long, heavy moment. You need to be completely aware of the gravity of what you are proposing. If you pull this thread and find what you're looking for, you aren't just cutting toxic ties. You are initiating a sequence of events that will likely end with your father in a jail cell. I pictured the text message. I disown you. I pictured the empty lockbox where my grandfather's watch used to be. I heard the laughter from the video. To the wallet. He made his choice when he decided I was nothing more than an appliance, I said, standing up. I'm just doing my job. I trace where the hidden money goes. I left Audrey's glass tower and immediately shifted into investigative overdrive. This was no longer just a messy family dispute. This was a potential felony fraud investigation, and I was in my element. My first step was gathering open-source intelligence. I pulled the public tax filings for the Sophia Community Medical Relief Fund. On the surface, to an untrained eye, the documents looked completely legitimate. Revenue came in from community bake sales and local business donations, and grants ostensibly went out to cover pharmacy bills. But my eye isn't untrained. I noticed a glaring red flag immediately. The administrative expenses line item was astronomically high, unusually high for a hyperlocal charity run entirely by neighborhood volunteers out of their living rooms. There was a leak, but to find the source of the drip, I needed the raw, unfiltered bank statements. I drove straight to Mrs. Sophia's modest house. Her daughter, Elena, answered the front door. Elena looked exhausted, carrying the heavy, visible weight that only full-time caregiving can inflict on a person. Ethan? She asked, her eyes widening in surprise. I haven't seen you in years. Hi, Elena, I said softly, keeping my posture non-threatening. I know this is incredibly sudden and highly awkward, but I urgently need to speak with you regarding the medical fund. Specifically, regarding my father's management of it. I sat with her at her kitchen table. I didn't dump the entire traumatic history of my family onto her. I maintained a professional boundary. I simply explained that Robert and I had experienced a severe, permanent falling out regarding ethical financial practices, and based on my professional expertise as a fraud examiner, I had credible reasons to suspect his accounting for her mother's fund might be highly inaccurate. I offered to conduct a comprehensive, forensic audit of the entire fund, completely free of charge. Elena hesitated, wringing her hands. Your dad has been so incredibly helpful, Ethan. He handles all the banking and the confusing paperwork so Mom doesn't have to stress about it while she's doing chemo. I know he presents himself that way, I said gently, feeling a surge of disgust for my father's manipulation. And I truly hope my instincts are dead wrong. I hope I look at the numbers and everything is perfectly balanced. But if I am right, your mother might be losing crucial funds she desperately needs for her treatments. Isn't it worth an hour of checking just to be absolutely certain? The mention of her mother's treatment broke her hesitation. She nodded and brought out a laptop, logging into the fund's primary banking portal. With her explicit permission, I downloaded 36 months of raw transaction history in CSV format. I drove back to my apartment, locked the door, and imported the massive dataset directly into my firm's proprietary forensic analytical software. I set the parameters and initiated the algorithms, looking for anomalies, repeating payment structures, and unauthorized vendor creations. It took the software barely 4 hours to highlight the undeniable, sickening pattern. It wasn't a sophisticated, Wall Street-level embezzlement scheme. It was actually stupidly, arrogantly simple. But that is the fundamental flaw of extreme narcissists. They genuinely believe they are so vastly superior to everyone else that no one will ever dare to double-check their work. First, there was a steady stream of unauthorized ATM cash withdrawals. $500 here, $800 there. Robert had lazily labeled them in the memo line as petty cash for events, or gasoline reimbursement. But the real bleeding came from the wire transfers. Every month, large, even-numbered checks were written out to an entity named Consulting Services LLC. I opened a new window and ran a deep background search on the LLC's registration data with the state. The business was registered to a generic P.O. box. I recognized the zip code and the box number immediately. It was the exact same P.O. box my brother Jason had used years ago for a failed online sneaker resale business that never generated a single dollar of legitimate profit. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. I exported my personal ledger, the one tracking every time I had denied their requests for extra cash, and cross-referenced the dates with the fraudulent withdrawals from the charity account. The correlation was a 1-to-1 match. On November 12th, I had firmly told Robert the first would not pay his exorbitant country club golf fees. On November 14th, a check for $1,200 was cut from the cancer fund and deposited into Jason's Consulting Services LLC. On July 4th, I had refused to pay Jason's lapsed car insurance premium. On July 6th, an $800 cash withdrawal was pulled from the charity fund. I pushed my chair back from the desk, feeling physically ill. The total amount stolen wasn't just a few grand. Over the course of 3 years, my father and my brother had systematically siphoned exactly $60,000 from the account. $60,000 stolen directly from a terrified, elderly woman slowly dying of cancer. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. My hands were freezing cold. The dynamic had shifted entirely. This was no longer just a story about a toxic, ungrateful family exploiting a successful son. This was a documented criminal enterprise. Robert and Jason were not just emotional abusers. They were financial predators. And I, the son they had proudly disowned and labeled a pathetic ATM, was sitting in my living room holding the undisputed, mathematically irrefutable receipts that would bury them both. I had the raw bank statements. I had the cross-reference dates that aligned perfectly with my personal ledger of denied financial requests. But in the world of forensic accounting, coincidence is not evidence. I needed to absolutely bulletproof the connection between the stolen funds and Jason's shell company. As an investigator, you never assume, you document. I dove deeper into the state's corporate registry database. Consulting Services LLC was a masterclass in lazy fraud. The entity was legally formed exactly 2 weeks after Robert had aggressively taken over the treasurer duties for the Sophia Memorial Fund. The registered agent listed on the filing was an online legal service, a common tactic used to obscure true ownership. But people who commit financial crimes out of arrogance always leave a backdoor open because they are fundamentally cheap. Jason hadn't paid for the premium anonymity package. By pulling the original articles of organization, I found the digital footprint of the credit card used to pay the state filing fee. It was an old card ending in 4 specific digits. I recognized those digits instantly. It was the exact same credit card Jason had maxed out 3 years ago, the very same card I had personally paid off to save him from a default judgment. The circle was completely closed. Robert, leveraging his position of absolute trust within the community, was intentionally authorizing fraudulent checks from a dying woman's charity account. He was then funneling those checks directly into a fake business entity entirely owned and operated by his favored, unemployed son. Jason would cash the checks, effectively laundering the money, and the two of them would split the proceeds to fund their lifestyle while simultaneously screaming at me that they were on the verge of starvation. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows in my quiet apartment. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all was almost difficult to process. They had committed a Class 3 felony. They had crossed the line from being emotionally abusive parasites to actively engaging in a criminal conspiracy that targeted a vulnerable, elderly cancer patient. And they did it all while calling me an ungrateful ATM. A cold, hardened resolve settled over me. There was no more internal conflict. There was no lingering, pathetic hope that my father might one day wake up and actually love me for who I was, rather than what I could finance. The good son, who had bent over backward, sacrificed his own future, and endured endless psychological manipulation, was officially dead. In his place was a corporate auditor holding a binder full of irrefutable, mathematically proven felonies. It was time to close the trap. The following morning, the sun barely up, I was sitting across from Audrey in her downtown office. I didn't say a word as I slid a thick, perfectly organized binder across the polished mahogany desk. Audrey opened it. I watched her sharp eyes scan the summary page I had drafted, then flip through the highlighted bank statements, the LLC registration documents, and the cross-reference timeline. The silence in the room was heavy, professional, and deadly. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mix of professional admiration and grim realization. "Ethan," she said, her voice low, "this is airtight. You have handed the district attorney a fully wrapped conviction with a bow on top. It establishes motive, means, and opportunity with zero room for reasonable doubt." "I know," I said flatly. "I want you to prepare the formal package for the DA's office. But before we drop the criminal hammer, I have a civil matter to finalize." Audrey raised an eyebrow. "The credit line?" "Exactly," I replied. "When Robert sent that text message disowning me, he unknowingly gave me the legal justification to sever all financial ties. I have already initiated the dispute process to remove myself as the guarantor on his $48,000 business line of credit. I need you to send a formal, legally binding notification to his bank, attaching his text message as proof of the severed relationship, demanding immediate removal of my name." Audrey smiled that same predatory grin. "You realize what that will trigger, don't you? If he loses his prime guarantor, and his business accounts show zero incoming revenue to support the debt, the bank will instantly panic. They won't just freeze the card. They will call the debt in full." "Yes," I said, leaning back. "They will demand the $48,000 immediately. When he cannot pay it, they will move to secure their assets. They will place a lien on his house. The same house the mortgage company is currently preparing to foreclose on because I stopped the $2,500 monthly payments. I was executing a perfectly synchronized financial demolition. The criminal charges would take time to process through the legal system, but the banks move with terrifying speed when they smell insolvency. I was mathematically dismantling every single safety net Robert had spent years forcing me to weave for him. "Consider it done," Audrey said, making a swift note on her legal pad. "I will overnight the revocation notice to the creditors today. I will also contact the district attorney's white-collar crime division to set up a secure handover of this binder. Are you absolutely prepared for the fallout, Ethan? Once this leaves my office, there is no undo button." "My father hit the undo button on our relationship on Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon," I said. standing up and straightening my jacket. I am just processing the paperwork. The financial shockwaves hit Robert long before the police ever knocked on his door. It took exactly 5 days for the banking infrastructure to completely collapse around him. It was a late Tuesday evening. I was at home, reading a book, enjoying the profound peace of an apartment that I completely owned, both financially and emotionally. At approximately 9 o'clock, a frantic, heavy pounding echoed from my front door. I didn't rush. I walked over and checked the security camera feed on my phone. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Robert. But he looked nothing like the arrogant, booming patriarch who had dominated my entire existence. He looked shrunken, disheveled, and completely frantic. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt, his hair was uncombed, and he was physically trembling. The untouchable king had finally been dragged out of his castle. I opened the door, but I kept the heavy steel security chain firmly engaged. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Ethan," he gasped, pushing his face near the crack in the door. The smell of stale alcohol wafted into my apartment. "Thank God. You have to let me in. Please, son, you have to let me in." Notice the vocabulary shift. I was suddenly son again. "I am not unlocking this door, Robert. State your business or I am calling building security," I replied. "The bank," he stammered, his eyes wide with genuine primal terror. "They froze everything, Ethan. They called the entire business loan. $48,000. Due immediately. And Patricia told me the mortgage is in default. They are going to take the house. You have to log in and authorize the transfers. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you were just upset." He was desperately deploying the Darvo tactic: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. In his mind, I was the irrational aggressor who had simply thrown a temper tantrum, and he was the victim of my sudden, inexplicable cruelty. "I didn't make a mistake," I stated simply. "I followed your instructions. You disowned me. All communication goes through lawyers." "I was just angry," he shouted, his voice cracking, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't mean it. You are my blood. You cannot do this to your own family." Then the true desperation bled out. "And the police called me, Ethan," he whispered, looking frantically up and down the empty hallway. "A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit. They want me to come in for questioning tomorrow regarding the Sophia Fund. They mentioned fraud. Felony fraud." He reached his fingers through the crack in the door, trying to grasp the edge. "You have to fix this. You're an auditor. You know how to manipulate these things. Tell them you authorized the transfers. Tell them it was a legal loan to Jason. I will pay it all back. I swear to God. Just doctor the files, Ethan. Save me. Be my son one last time." I stood there, looking through the narrow opening at the man who had terrorized me, manipulated me, and drained me of over $150,000. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was actively begging me to commit a massive federal crime, to destroy my own pristine career, and to potentially go to prison just to shield him from the consequences of his own grotesque greed. Even now, at the very bitter end of his rope, he truly believed I was nothing more than a sacrificial lamb born to absorb his sins. "You stole $60,000 from a dying woman, Robert," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hallway like a surgical blade. "And you used Jason to launder the cash." Robert physically flinched as if I had struck him in the face. His tears instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of cornered, defensive rage. "He needed the money," Robert yelled, spit flying from his lips. "He is your brother." He was struggling. What was I supposed to do? Just let him fail? "Yes," I said, my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "You let him fail. Instead, you robbed a cancer patient and then tried to bleed me dry to cover your own mortgage." "I need a lawyer," he whimpered, the anger instantly dissolving back into pathetic desperation as reality crushed him again. "They want a $25,000 retainer just to take the criminal case. I don't have it, Ethan. The bank locked my accounts. Please, Write the check. I will never, ever ask you for another dime. I will sign whatever you want. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket hanging by the door. I pulled out a neatly folded piece of thick, legal-grade paper. I actually have something for you, I said calmly. His eyes lit up with a pathetic, desperate spark of hope. He genuinely thought I was handing him a cashier's check. He reached his shaking hand through the gap in the door. I handed him the document. He unfolded it eagerly under the hallway light. It wasn't a check. It was a formal copy of the criminal complaint filed by the district attorney's office, provided to Audrey earlier that afternoon as a courtesy. The bold text at the top read, State versus Robert and Jason. Charges: embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, grand theft, and elder abuse enhancements. You should really give that to your lawyer, I advised him in a perfectly flat corporate tone. Assuming you can find a public defender who works for free. All the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords refused to produce a sound. The illusion of his control was dead. Goodbye, Robert, I said. No, Ethan, wait. I own you, he screamed, suddenly throwing his entire body weight against the heavy wood, trying to force his way inside. You disowned me, I corrected him. I pushed the door shut with one firm, definitive motion. The heavy lock clicked into place. I threw the deadbolt. I walked away from the door, ignoring the sound of him sobbing and violently pounding his fists against the wood until building security inevitably arrived to drag him out. The thing about extreme narcissists and their golden children is that they possess a pathological need to control the narrative. Even when the ship is at the bottom of the ocean, they will loudly declare that they are simply submarine captains. 2 days after Robert's pathetic late-night visit, Jason cracked. The rumors were already swirling rapidly through my parents' affluent suburban community. Neighbors talk, and bank foreclosure notices posted on front doors are impossible to hide. Jason, operating in a state of pure, unadulterated panic as the criminal investigation loomed, decided he needed to get ahead of the story and spin the public perception. I was sitting at my desk at work when a former high school friend texted me a single screenshot with the message, "Dude, have you seen this?" I opened the image. It was a massive, rambling essay posted publicly on Jason's social media page, visible to hundreds of people in our hometown. I cannot believe I am being forced to address this publicly. The post began, dripping with manufactured victimhood. My brother, Ethan, is a deeply bitter and violently jealous person. He has always been jealous of the special bond one share with our father. Now, because Dad finally stood up to his toxic behavior and cut him off, Ethan is spreading horrific lies to destroy our family name. I kept reading, sipping my coffee. The sheer stupidity of what came next was breathtaking. He is actively claiming that money is missing from the Sophia Charity Fund. Jason wrote, "Well, guess what? Ethan is a professional auditor. He is the one who knows how to illegally move numbers around on a computer. He is actively framing our father to cover his own tracks because he is broke. The $60,000 wasn't stolen. It was legally approved management fees for Consulting Services LLC, and Ethan is trying to illegally twist it to put us in jail." I actually laughed out loud in my quiet office. It was a genuine, hearty laugh. In a single, emotionally unhinged social media post, my 35-year-old brother had just accomplished 3 miraculous things for the prosecution. 1. He publicly admitted that he knew the exact specific amount missing was $60,000, a highly classified detail the police had not yet released to the public. 2. He publicly confirmed the direct involvement of Consulting Services LLC, effectively confessing to his active role in the conspiracy to receive the funds. 3. He attempted to publicly frame a licensed fraud examiner, adding a potential charge of witness intimidation and defamation to his rapidly growing list of problems. I didn't reply to the post. I didn't defend myself in the comments. I simply saved a high-resolution screenshot of the entire post, including the timestamp and the URL, and emailed it directly to Audrey and the lead detective at the Financial Crimes Unit. Audrey replied less than 3 minutes later. Her email contained only 2 sentences. Did he seriously just publish a written confession to felony conspiracy on the internet? He just handed the DA a guaranteed conviction wrapped in a solid gold bow. By the time Jason realized his catastrophic legal blunder and hastily deleted the post an hour later, it was far too late. The internet is permanent, and the screenshot was already securely filed in the prosecutor's primary evidence folder. The stage was completely set. The trap was sprung. The final confrontation I had subconsciously waited for my entire adult life did not happen with a screaming match in a living room. It happened exactly the way it should, methodically, legally, and in broad daylight. It was 10 o'clock on a bright Saturday morning. The kind of perfect, sunny weekend morning where the affluent neighbors in my parents' subdivision were out washing their expensive cars, walking their purebred dogs, and meticulously maintaining their public images. I was not physically present to witness the event, but in a tight-knit community fueled by gossip, you don't need a front-row seat to see the show. A neighbor who had always despised Robert's arrogant attitude filmed the entire sequence from behind their living room curtains and gleefully forwarded the video to everyone they knew. It eventually reached my phone. I sat on my comfortable sofa and pressed play. The video was slightly grainy, but the details were impossible to miss. 2 heavily marked police cruisers were parked aggressively at angles in my parents' driveway. The exact same driveway I had paid $3,000 to have repaved and sealed just last summer. Their red and blue emergency lights were flashing silently, reflecting off the pristine garage doors. The front door of the house opened. 2 uniformed officers escorted Robert out first. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp, designer polo shirt or his expensive golf slacks. He was wearing a faded, stained bathrobe and slippers. He looked incredibly old, frail, and thoroughly confused, as if his brain simply refused to process the reality of his situation. His hands were cuffed securely behind his back. He wasn't physically fighting the officers, but I could clearly see him shouting. His face was bright red, his jaw working furiously as he pointed his chin at the cops, demanding they release him, demanding they call his lawyer, demanding they respect his authority. He genuinely looked like he believed he could simply order the police off his property, as if criminal charges were just a misunderstanding beneath a man of his immense stature. Then, a few seconds later, Jason emerged from the house. If Robert was furious, Jason was completely broken. My older brother, the golden child, the man who had mocked me as a pathetic ATM, was weeping openly. His face was buried in his chest, his shoulders heaving with massive, uncontrollable sobs. He looked exactly like a terrified toddler who had been caught stealing candy, not a grown man facing a massive federal indictment for grand theft. He actively tried to hide his face from the dozen neighbors who had stopped walking their dogs to stand on the sidewalk and stare, but there was nowhere to hide. The officers guided them both down the driveway. The patriarch and the golden child, stripped of their arrogance, stripped of my money, and escorted into the cramped back seats of 2 separate police cruisers. The heavy doors slammed shut. It was the definitive collapse of the house they built on my back. I watched the cruisers back out of the driveway and disappear down the suburban street. I locked my phone screen and set it down on the coffee table. I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. I had expected to feel a massive, overwhelming rush of absolute triumph. I had expected to feel like a champion standing over a defeated enemy. But I didn't. I just felt a profound, heavy sense of waste. All that money, all that effort, all those years of anxiety, manipulation, tears, and desperate attempts to buy a shred of familial love. And it all culminated with an old man in a bathrobe sitting in the back of a police car. The legal process that followed the dramatic Saturday morning arrest was brutal, highly efficient, and utterly devastating for them. Because I had permanently frozen his access to the business credit lines and halted the mortgage payments, Robert possessed zero liquid capital. His arrogant request for a taxpayer-funded public defender was initially denied by the court because, on paper, he owned a suburban home with massive equity. However, that equity was an absolute mirage, entirely held up by my monthly cash injections. Once the bank officially realized the monthly payments had permanently ceased and the primary owner was currently sitting in a county jail cell awaiting trial, the foreclosure process resumed with terrifying, ruthless speed. Robert eventually managed to secure a bottom-tier defense attorney who specialized in quickly pleading guilty, not fighting for acquittals. The true betrayal, however, occurred in the police interrogation room long before the trial began. Faced with the reality of state prison time, Jason, the ultimate coward, completely folded. He didn't just fold. He enthusiastically threw his father directly under the bus to save his own skin. He signed a plea deal, formally testifying that the entire embezzlement scheme was Robert's exclusive idea, painting himself as merely a naive son following his intimidating father's orders. The trial took place 3 months later. I was formally subpoenaed as an expert witness for the prosecution. Walking into that grand courtroom was a surreal, out-of-body experience. I saw my mother, Patricia, sitting alone in the very back row of the gallery. She looked as though she had aged 10 years in 90 days. The affluent friends she used to desperately brag to, the social circle she sacrificed everything to impress, were nowhere to be seen. Total scandal is a highly effective isolator. She caught my eye as I walked down the aisle. Her face crumpled, and she silently mouthed the word, "Why?" I didn't look away. I didn't show an ounce of guilt. I just gave her a small, brief nod of acknowledgement and walked straight to the witness stand. I did not testify with anger. I did not testify with sadness. I testified using pure, cold facts. "Can you explain the parameters of this financial spreadsheet, Mr. Ethan?" the district attorney asked, projecting my meticulously maintained ledger onto a large screen for the jury. "This is a precise forensic record of unauthorized cash withdrawals from the Sophia Community Relief Fund," I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I cross-referenced these dates and amounts with direct deposits into the corporate account of Consulting Services LLC, an entity legally registered to my brother, Jason." At the defense table, Robert glared at me. He looked like a trapped, feral animal. He was absolutely furious that his wallet was speaking against him, destroying his life with numbers he couldn't comprehend. But his glare held absolutely zero power over me anymore. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all felony charges. Thanks to his cowardly plea deal and his testimony against his own father, Jason received a suspended sentence and 5 years of highly restrictive probation. But the judge also slapped him with a massive restitution order to repay the stolen $60,000. He avoided a jail cell, but his reputation was permanently incinerated. He was legally branded a fraudster and was forced to take a grueling night shift job at a shipping warehouse just to make the mandated court payments. Robert was not offered a deal. The judge, an incredibly stern woman who had zero tolerance for predators exploiting the sick, looked at my father with pure disgust. "You were entrusted with the care of a highly vulnerable, dying woman," the judge stated, her voice echoing in the courtroom. "You weaponized that trust to illegally fund your own lifestyle, all while your own son was actively supporting you financially. Your absolute lack of remorse is staggering." She sentenced him to 5 years in state prison, followed by a lengthy parole period. I watched the bailiff lock the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. As they led him away toward the holding cells, he didn't scream. He didn't curse at me. He just slumped forward, looking utterly defeated. The terrifying giant who had ruled my life was entirely gone. A month after the sentencing, the bank executed the final foreclosure. The large colonial house I grew up in was sold at a public auction on the courthouse steps for pennies on the dollar to a corporate flipping company. The dust eventually settled. Patricia, having lost her husband to prison, her golden child to a warehouse job, and her beautiful home to the bank, was forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial edge of town, surviving solely on meager government assistance checks. A few weeks after she moved, I received a letter in the mail from her. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a moment of reflection or a plea for reconciliation. It was exactly what I expected. A final, desperate guilt trip. "I hope you are finally happy, Ethan," she wrote in her loopy handwriting. You got your cruel justice. You sent your father to a cage. But you don't have a family anymore. You are completely alone. I stood in my kitchen and read the words twice. Then, I struck a match, held the corner of the paper over the sink, and watched the letter burn into gray ash. She was fundamentally wrong. I didn't have a loving family before the trial. I had a massive, parasitic financial liability masquerading as a bloodline. Now, for the first time in my life, I had a completely clean slate. While their entire fake empire was rapidly imploding, my world was quietly and beautifully expanding. I took the $2,500 a month that I used to blindly transfer for their mortgage, and I redirected every single cent into a high-yield savings account. I called it the Freedom Fund. Within a year, I used that money to put a massive down payment on a house of my own. It is not a massive, ostentatious 4-bedroom mansion designed to impress wealthy neighbors I don't care about. It is a sleek, mid-century modern property with massive windows that let in the morning light, a quiet office for my forensic work, and a small, private garden in the back. It belongs entirely to me. My name is the only name on the deed. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with a sudden jolt. My heart races, expecting to see a frantic text message demanding emergency cash, expecting a manufactured crisis, expecting that heavy, suffocating tightness in my chest that used to greet me every single morning like an abusive roommate. But I check my phone, and the screen is dark. The only sound is the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the wind moving through the trees outside my window. People who know the broad strokes of the story occasionally ask me if I feel lonely. Don't you miss them? They ask, usually with a look of pity. They are your flesh and blood, Ethan. And I always give them the exact same answer. You do not miss a tumor after the surgeon removes it. You might occasionally miss the part of your body it took with it. You might have a scar that aches when the weather gets cold, but you never, ever miss the sickness. I realized that silence is not the same thing as loneliness. For 32 years, my family used their silence as a weapon, a psychological punishment designed to terrify me into compliance whenever I failed to write a check fast enough. My silence now is entirely different. It is peace. It is the absolute, unbroken sound of a life that belongs exclusively to me. I cannot audit a relationship that refuses to keep honest books. I cannot balance an emotional ledger with people who genuinely believe they are fully entitled to my absolute bankruptcy. Stopping the payments was never truly about the money. The money was just the mechanism. It was about reclaiming my reality and establishing a boundary made of solid steel. My life now is exceptionally quiet, highly structured, and entirely peaceful. I have a few scars, and I have deep trust issues that I am actively working through with a professional, but I am finally free. For the first time in 32 years, the numbers make perfect sense. The ledger is permanently balanced, and the account is officially closed.